If you've grown up watching mainstream American news, then you've probably watched 60 Minutes. It's an American institution that has informed Americans for close to 6 decades about what's going on in the country and around the world. The show is noted for its incredible interviews and first-rate news programming. But what made the show even more enjoyable were the variety of 60 Minutes hosts. They became a part of our lives each night when they informed us about what was going on in the world. Join Facts First to learn about some of the most famous 60 Minutes hosts then and now. Mike Wallace. Mike was arguably one of America's most outstanding journalists, and it was a great loss for the country when we lost him on April 7, 2012 at the age of 93. He began his career as a radio journalist before graduating to television during its golden age. Apart from his news reporting, he was also responsible for hosting some of the most important television documentaries of all time, including The Hate That Hate Produced about the Nation of Islam. He became close with one of the nation's most prominent ministers, Malcolm X, and later interviewed him in 1964. Mike Wallace gained a reputation for being a respectful interviewer who wasn't afraid to tackle complex subjects with controversial figures. Wallace became one of the lead hosts of 60 Minutes in the 1960s and retired from the show in 2006. Some of his most memorable moments over 40 years of hosting was when he challenged Minister Louis Farrakhan on the corruption of the U.S., his interview with President Ronald Reagan, and his interview with author Ayn Rand. Mike Wallace retired and lived a quiet life until his death in 2012. Before we tell you more about each of the most famous 60 Minutes hosts, be sure to give this video a like and subscribe to Facts First if you haven't already. Harry Reasoner. Harry Reasoner also began his career working in radio journalism for CBS Radio. He briefly worked for the U.S. Information Agency and was based in the Philippines. One of his early successes in radio was covering JFK's assassination. He also covered Lee Harvey Oswald and provided live coverage of Oswald's arrest. The nation was gripped by Harry Reasoner's fascinating reporting, and he established himself as one of America's great radio journalists. He joined up with Mike Wallace in 1968 to help create 60 Minutes. Harry Reasoner was one of the hosts of the show, a producer, and also served as a writer. He remained with the show until he retired in May of 1991. Sadly, he passed away a few months later in August at the age of 68. Morley Safer. In the 1950s, Morley Safer was a well-known news reporter and war correspondent working with the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. He became famous for reporting on some of the most harrowing wars around the world, including the Arab-Israeli conflict, the Civil War in Nigeria, and the Vietnam War. His skills as a reporter became known beyond the borders of Canada. He was asked to replace Harry Reasoner as a reporter and host on 60 Minutes after he left the show. Morley Safer developed a reputation for being able to ask pressing questions to guests without seeming too pushy. He had a calm and friendly demeanor, and this helped him challenge his guests with ease. He died shortly after his retirement in 2016. He's remembered as one of the greatest journalists in the English-speaking world, and there's an award bestowed in his honor called the Morley Safer Award for Dan Rather. Without a doubt, Dan Rather is one of the most recognizable faces on American television. He began his career as a reporter in Huntsville, Texas, working for the Associated Press. From these humble beginnings, he became a reliable face to report on some of the nation's and the world's most important events, ranging from JFK's assassination to the Watergate scandal. He became one of the most well-known reporters to host 60 Minutes, and though he has retired now, he's still regarded as one of the last few examples of great journalism in the country. Rather has received so much acclaim in his life that before the Iraq War, Saddam Hussein personally requested Dan should moderate a debate between him and President George W. Bush. Needless to say, this never happened, but if there was ever a person who could do a great job, it would have been Dan Rather. Ed Bradley. Ed Bradley's first claim to fame was when he reported on the 1964 race riots in Philadelphia. He began his career as a radio reporter before graduating to television. He also served as a White House correspondent and covered Jimmy Carter's presidential campaign. He joined 60 Minutes in 1981 when Dan Rather left his hosting duties. Producer Don Hewitt later stated Ed Bradley was hired because of his reporting skills and the fact that he was a gentleman. What made Ed Bradley stick out was that he managed to show the human side to many of his larger-than-life guests. His most notable interviews included Lena Horne, Muhammad Ali, and Jack Henry Abbott. He also received acclaim for reporting on schizophrenia. He conducted the only interview of Timothy McVeigh and also received acclaim for his reporting on the AIDS crisis in Africa. He also invested Emmett Till's murder and the sexual abuse scandals within the Catholic Church. Ed Bradley died in 2006 from leukemia. Diane Sawyer. Diane Sawyer came a long way from her early days as a weather forecaster at a Kentucky news station. She became the first female correspondent at 60 Minutes in 1984 and became one of the show's most acclaimed hosts. By the time she was hired for the show, she had already gained a notorious reputation. She worked alongside President Richard Nixon to help him write his memoirs, as well as prepare for the now infamous interviews with Sir David Frost. There were even rumors that Sawyer was Deep Throat, though later it was confirmed this was W. Mark Felt. She served as a 60 Minutes correspondent from 1984 to 89 before moving on to other programs. She's now best known as one of the hosts of 2020, a position she's held since 1998. Meredith Vieira. Like many of her 60 Minutes colleagues, Meredith Vieira began her career working in radio in the 1970s. She became famous as a reporter in Chicago in the early 80s and was later hired as host and correspondent for 60 Minutes. She served as a reporter for 60 Minutes from 1989 to 91. This further catapulted her to fame and brought forward many opportunities. She eventually left CBS and moved to ABC to become a correspondent for the show Turning Point. She also became the host of Intimate Portrait on the Lifetime Network. Before Regis Philbin, Meredith Vieira was the first host of the American version of Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. She later became the host of her own self-titled show. Her current claim to fame is as the host of the game show 25 Words or Less. Bob Simon. Bob Simon is remembered as one of America's great journalists. His first major breakthrough was when he reported on the Troubles in Northern Ireland. His resume included reporting on the Gulf War, the Israeli-Lebanese conflict, and the student protests at Tiananmen Square. He joined 60 Minutes in 1996 and received many awards for his reporting. He gained a great reputation for discussing foreign events and keeping Americans informed of what was happening overseas. His awards included Peabody Awards and Emmy Awards, and he was greatly loved by the public and his colleagues. He died in 2015 from serious injuries from a car crash. Christiane Amanpour. The British-born Christiane Amanpour emigrated to the U.S. to study journalism at the University of Rhode Island. She joined CNN in 1983 as a desk assistant. She rose the ranks to become a correspondent focusing on foreign news. She covered the Iran-Iraq War and later reported on the fall of communism in Eastern Europe. Her career was successful enough to land her a brief spot on 60 Minutes and become the host of her own show. She briefly served as a special correspondent for 60 Minutes and received a Peabody Award for her work. But producer Jeff Fager wasn't a fan and eventually terminated her contract. She also eventually replaced Charlie Rose to host her own show on PBS. Lara Logan. Lara Logan grew up in South Africa and began her journalism career as a reporter for the Sunday Tribune in Durban. She later became a freelancer and covered international conflicts around the world. She also worked as a breakfast television reporter in the UK. She was given several opportunities to report for 60 Minutes and discussed a variety of topics, focusing mainly on foreign affairs and international conflicts. In recent years, she was hired to host her own show on Fox News called Lara Logan Has No Agenda. She's currently taking a break from journalism and stated in 2022 she's no longer working with Fox News. Steve Kroft. Steve Kroft became a prominent journalist when he served at WJXT in Jacksonville and exposed corruption in the city. He later moved to Miami and became a reporter for WPLG-TV. There, he caught the eye of CBS execs and was offered opportunities to report for the station. One of his earliest successes with CBS was reporting on the assassination of Prime Minister Indira Gandhi, for which he won an Emmy. He also received high acclaim for his reporting on 60 Minutes. He conducted interviews with major personalities, most notably President Barack Obama. Steve Kroft is now retired and recognized as one of America's most eminent journalists. He's made a cameo appearance as himself in the show Murphy Brown and in Woody Allen's film Small Time Crooks. John Dickerson. John Dickerson worked as a reporter for Time magazine for 12 years and worked as a White House correspondent as well. He's also written books such as On Her Trail about his mother, journalist Nancy Dickerson. He also wrote The Hardest Job in the World about the responsibilities and lives of American presidents. Dickerson has also gained a reputation for being a great and challenging interviewer. His style has been given the moniker Dickersonian. He once caught President George W. Bush off guard in a question about 9/11. The president remarked he wished John had given him the question in advance. John Dickerson is currently working with 60 Minutes as a correspondent. Now it's time to hear from you. Who's your favorite 60 Minutes reporter? Let us know in the comments section below. And before you go, make sure you give this video a like and subscribe to FactsVerse if you haven't already. Click the bell icon to stay updated on all our latest content.